Did you ever wonder how close a life can come to ending without anyone realizing it in time? Because sometimes the most dangerous moment doesn't happen on the road. It happens quietly, alone, in a hotel room. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And if investigators are to be believed, that's exactly where this story truly begins. Picture this: a luxury hotel room in Nigeria. Early morning light creeping through the curtains. The city already awake, buzzing, impatient. Traffic building, horns blaring in the distance. Another day starting like any other. Inside that room, everything looks normal, almost too normal. A neatly made bed, clothes folded or draped over a chair, a tablet charging by the nightstand, a phone resting face down, screen dark, silent. No chaos, no panic. No sign that, just hours later, the world would be replaying grainy footage of a shirtless, dazed boxing icon sitting in shattered glass on the side of a highway. Anthony Joshua, former heavyweight champion, one of the most recognizable athletes on the planet, and according to reports, completely unaware of what he allegedly hadn't seen. Here's the question that investigators, journalists, and fans can't stop asking now. What if the warning signs were already there and no one noticed? Or worse, what if they were noticed, sent, delivered, and simply never read? This isn't just a story about a car crash. It's about timing, silence, and how modern life hides urgency behind glowing screens we think we'll check in a minute. Because allegedly, when investigators later examined Joshua's devices, they found something that stopped them cold. Multiple unread messages. Messages sent before the crash. Messages urging caution. Messages warning him not to travel that morning. And if that's true, and we'll be careful to frame everything as alleged and under investigation, then the implications are chilling. But let's slow down. Because to understand how something like this could happen, you have to rewind. You have to understand the mindset, the environment, the assumptions that come with fame, routine, and security. You have to understand why someone like Anthony Joshua wouldn't expect danger at all. Athletes at that level don't move like ordinary people. Their lives run on schedules tighter than championship training camps. Every movement is planned, every trip coordinated, every risk assessed, or at least that's the belief. Hotels are vetted, routes are planned, security details follow behind, drivers are experienced, convoys are formed. And after doing this hundreds of times across dozens of countries, a sense of invincibility can quietly creep in. Not arrogance, familiarity. And familiarity is dangerous. Because when nothing bad has happened before, the mind starts telling a story. This is fine. We've done this 100 times. Nothing ever happens. Until it does. That morning, according to officials, Joshua was scheduled to leave the hotel shortly before midday. Nothing unusual on paper. Just another drive. Another stretch of road. Another routine transition from one location to another. But roads don't care about routine. And neither does fate. At approximately 11 a.m. on the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway in Magong, an SUV reportedly traveling at speed attempted an overtaking maneuver. According to Nigerian road safety officials, the vehicle lost control and collided with a stationary truck parked along the roadside. The impact was violent. Glass exploded. Metal crumpled. Silence followed chaos. 2 people lost their lives. Joshua survived, sustaining what authorities later described as minor injuries, though footage showed him visibly dazed. The look of someone whose body had absorbed a shock his mind was still trying to understand. The internet did what it always does. Clips spread within minutes. Speculation exploded within hours. Narratives formed before facts could catch up. Some called it reckless. Others called it tragic. Many asked the same question again and again. How did this happen? But here's what most people didn't know at the time. The crash may not have been the first warning that day. According to sources familiar with the investigation, and again, these claims remain alleged, authorities later examined Joshua's phone and tablet as part of a standard post-incident review. And what they allegedly found shifted the focus of the story. Not to the road, not to the truck, not even to the driver, but back to that hotel room, back to those devices, back to the quiet glow of unread notifications. Multiple WhatsApp messages, sent by people described as close contacts and members of his security circle. Messages urging him not to leave the hotel that morning due to what was described as unusual activity near the highway. Let that sink in. If this is accurate, then somewhere between intention and impact, there was a window. A narrow one. A fragile one. A moment where a different decision could have been made. But that moment passed silently. No response. No acknowledgement. No reply. Because allegedly, those messages were never opened. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. How many unread messages are on your phone right now? 1, 10, 100? We live in a world where urgency competes with noise, where important warnings sit beside memes, group chats, promotions, and missed calls, where the brain learns to triage attention, often incorrectly. And when you're famous, that noise multiplies. Athletes like Joshua receive hundreds of messages a day. Advisors, friends, family, business partners, security updates, sponsorship requests, media inquiries. Most of it blends together. So when a warning arrives, unless it screams louder than the rest, it risks becoming just another notification, another vibration, another banner, another thing you'll check later. Except later never came. And this is where the story becomes haunting. Because investigators didn't just note the existence of unread messages. They reportedly focused on timestamps. When were the messages sent? How close were they to the time of departure? How long did they sit unopened? Minutes matter in cases like this. Sometimes seconds. A warning sent an hour earlier feels abstract. A warning sent moments before leaving feels personal. And according to those familiar with the inquiry, the timing raised serious questions. Questions about coordination. Questions about communication. Questions about whether the system designed to protect him actually failed. Not through malice, but through silence. Still, it's important to pause here. Because no one is accusing Anthony Joshua of wrongdoing. No one is saying he ignored warnings on purpose. And no one is claiming these messages alone would have prevented the crash. This isn't about blame. It's about vulnerability. It's about how even the strongest, most prepared people in the world are still subject to ordinary human limitations. Distraction, assumption, routine. And there's another layer to this that makes it even more unsettling. The phrase used in the messages, unusual activity near the highway, is vague. Almost too vague. What does that mean? Increased traffic? Suspicious vehicles? Reports of hazards? Rumors? Intuition? Security professionals often operate in gray areas. They don't always wait for confirmed threats. Sometimes they act on patterns, instincts, fragments of information that don't yet form a full picture. And when those instincts are shared, they rely on one thing to be effective: being seen. But if a warning is sent and never read, does it exist at all? That question sits at the heart of this story. Because when investigators allegedly reviewed the devices, they weren't just looking at content. They were looking at behavior. What was opened? What was ignored? What never made it past the lock screen? And that's where the story begins to shift from tragedy to something more philosophical. We spend our lives preparing for disasters we can imagine and overlooking the ones that arrive quietly. We install airbags. We hire drivers. We create convoys. We plan routes. But we assume the phone in our hand will always be there when we need it. What happens when it isn't? What happens when the one message that matters most is drowned out by everything else? As the investigation continued, officials focused on the physical mechanics of the crash. Speed, positioning, overtaking maneuvers, road conditions. But behind the scenes, according to sources, another narrative was forming. One that didn't involve engines or brakes. One that began with silence. And that's why this story matters now. Not because it's sensational. Not because it involves a famous name. But because it exposes something deeply uncomfortable about modern life. We are more connected than ever, and yet, critical information still slips through the cracks. If this can happen to someone surrounded by security, systems, and planning, what does that say about the rest of us? And here's the most chilling part. Investigators allegedly didn't freeze when they saw the messages themselves. They froze when they realized something didn't add up. The timestamps. Because when they compared the time the warnings were sent to the moment the convoy departed, the gap wasn't what anyone expected. And once they noticed that discrepancy, everything changed. The night before disasters rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with alarms or sirens. It doesn't shake windows or flood streets. Most of the time, It looks exactly like every other night that came before it. And that's what makes it so dangerous. Because according to those familiar with Anthony Joshua's movements in Nigeria, the evening before the crash was uneventful. No tension, no visible concern, no sense that anything was wrong. If you had walked past his hotel room that night, you wouldn't have stopped. Nothing about it would have demanded attention. No raised voices, no frantic calls, no urgent footsteps pacing the hallway. Just another night. And that's the first contradiction in this story. We tend to believe that major events are preceded by warning signs we can see. Raised red flags. Obvious danger. But reality doesn't work that way. Reality hides its sharpest edges behind normalcy. That night, Anthony Joshua was reportedly following a familiar routine. The kind that comes from years of travel, competition, and tightly controlled schedules. Athletes at his level don't improvise much. They rely on structure, predictability, repetition, dinner, rest, preparation for the next day. Nothing remarkable. And that's precisely why what happened next feels so unsettling. Because behind that calm surface, concern may already have been spreading. Quietly, selectively, and out of sight. Sources suggest that by late evening, people within Joshua's wider orbit were already aware of developments outside the hotel. Not panic, not certainty, just information. Fragments, whispers of road conditions, reports of activity along certain routes, observations that, on their own, might not mean much, but together started to form a pattern. This is how security concerns usually begin. Not with proof, with unease. And unease is hard to quantify. Security teams live in probabilities, not absolutes. They don't wait for danger to announce itself. They scan for irregularities, changes in rhythm, deviations from the expected. Something was off. But here's the thing. When you've moved through the world safely hundreds of times before, the brain learns to downplay uncertainty, especially when there's no immediate evidence of threat. It tells you, this will pass. It tells you it always does. It tells you, tomorrow will look like today. And that belief shapes decisions long before anyone realizes they're making them. That night, according to people close to the situation, there were conversations. Messages exchanged. Questions raised. Routes discussed. Possibilities weighed. Nothing dramatic. But concern doesn't need drama to be real. Imagine being part of a security team tasked with protecting someone as high-profile as Anthony Joshua. Your job isn't just to react to danger. It's to anticipate it. And anticipation often feels awkward because it asks you to act before others feel the need. Do you escalate based on incomplete information? Do you wait for confirmation? Do you risk being wrong? Being wrong carries its own cost. It disrupts schedules. It creates friction. It forces explanations. And when nothing ends up happening, it can make future warnings easier to ignore. So that night, the balance leaned toward caution, but not alarm. At least, not yet. Inside the hotel room, Joshua reportedly went about his evening like any other. There's no indication he was briefed on anything urgent. No suggestion that alarms were raised directly with him at that time. And that detail matters, because it establishes something critical. If warnings existed, and we'll examine that carefully later, they didn't begin as emergency signals. They evolved. And evolution takes time. Think about how often serious problems start quietly. A strange noise in your car you ignore. A health symptom you dismiss. A gut feeling you override because everything else seems fine. This was that kind of night. Outside, Lagos continued moving. Traffic flowed. Streets buzzed. Life didn't slow down to hint at what was coming. And inside the hotel, the atmosphere reportedly reflected that normalcy. No last-minute changes. No rerouted plans. No sense that the next morning would be any different. That's the second contradiction. Because if there truly was unusual activity near the highway, as later messages would allegedly suggest, it wasn't dramatic enough to interrupt routine. And routine is powerful. Routine tells you when to sleep, when to wake, when to leave. By the time Joshua reportedly settled in for the night, the next day already felt decided. Morning departure, scheduled movement, security convoy in place. End of story. Except it wasn't. Because sometime during that night, or very early the next morning, the tone may have shifted. Security concerns don't usually arrive all at once. They accumulate. A report here, an observation there, a piece of information that doesn't fit neatly with the rest. At first, you rationalize. Traffic is always bad. That road is always busy. Nothing unusual ever comes of this. But then the pattern tightens. And that's when decisions become harder. Those within the security circle allegedly faced a familiar dilemma. How much do you share, and when? Do you wake someone up for a possibility? Do you risk being ignored later by sounding the alarm too early now? Do you trust that things will stabilize by morning? There are no easy answers. And this is where human psychology steps in again. We like closure. We like certainty. We like to believe that unresolved concerns will resolve themselves overnight. So the night passes. Lights go out. Phones charge. Silence settles in. And somewhere in that silence, the stage is fully set. Because the next morning wouldn't start with chaos. It would start with alarms. A phone vibrating on a nightstand. A tablet lighting up with notifications. Another ordinary beginning. And here's the haunting thought. If warnings were sent during the night or early morning hours, if concern finally crossed the threshold from internal discussion to direct communication, they may have arrived at the worst possible time. That blurry window between sleep and waking, between habit and awareness, between intention and action. We've all lived that moment. You wake up, you glance at your phone, you see messages, you tell yourself you'll check them properly in a minute. But a minute is a lie we tell ourselves. Because mornings are momentum. Once movement starts, it rarely stops. Get dressed, grab keys, step out, and whatever you didn't absorb in that first glance often stays unread far longer than you expect. If that's what happened here, and again, this remains alleged, then the most important warnings of the day may have arrived at the exact moment they were least likely to be fully processed. Not ignored, just delayed. And delay can be deadly. What makes this even more unsettling is how preventable it feels in hindsight. But hindsight is cruel. It sharpens clarity only after the cost has been paid. The night before didn't feel dangerous. The morning didn't feel urgent. The departure didn't feel risky. Everything aligned to create a false sense of safety. And that's why investigators later focused so heavily on the timeline. Because danger doesn't always announce itself with force. Sometimes it slips through gaps created by routine, distraction, and the assumption that tomorrow will behave like yesterday. As the night gave way to morning, the decisions were already made. Or so it seemed. But somewhere between the quiet of that hotel room and the roar of the highway, something critical was missed. And when the convoy finally formed, and the vehicles pulled away from the curb, the window to change course may have already closed. What no one realized at the time was this. The most important part of the investigation wouldn't begin on the road. It would begin with what happened, or didn't happen, inside that room. And when investigators later pieced together the final hours before departure, one question kept resurfacing. Not about speed, not about traffic, not even about the crash itself, but about communication. Because if the warnings existed before the sun rose, why didn't they stop anything? But what came next would reveal how fragile the line between safety and disaster really is, and no one saw it coming. The morning sun in Lagos doesn't wait. It rises steadily, unapologetically, casting long shadows across streets already teeming with cars, motorcycles, and pedestrians. For most people, it's just another day. For Anthony Joshua, according to reports, it was the start of a routine journey, one that would end in chaos mere hours later. The hotel room was quiet. The air conditioning hummed softly. Outside, the city had begun to stir. Somewhere down the hall, staff prepared breakfast. Somewhere else, traffic reports scrolled across radio screens. Life continued as if nothing extraordinary were about to happen. And yet, as investigators would later suggest, the day was already carrying a subtle tension few could see. Joshua reportedly went about his early morning routine like clockwork. Perhaps a light breakfast, stretching or warm-ups, checking emails, a glance at his phone. Simple actions, repeated so often that they became second nature. The rhythm of his morning was familiar, comfortable, predictable, and therein lies a subtle danger. Predictability lulls even the most vigilant minds into a false sense of security. But that predictability masks something. According to sources familiar with the investigation, unread messages sat quietly on Joshua's devices, glowing softly on the screens. WhatsApp notifications from close contacts, security personnel, perhaps even local advisors. Alerts that, if he had read them, might have altered the course of the morning. The exact content of the messages has not been officially confirmed, but reports suggest they contained warnings, unusual activity near the highway, recommendations to delay travel, hints of potential risk along the route. Imagine that moment. You wake up, you see the pings, but the messages are not urgent in your mind. Maybe you glance and think, I'll check these in a minute. Minutes pass. The pressure of time, the weight of routines, the inertia of habit, all conspire to create a blind spot. A warning that existed, but not in a way that could be acted upon. Now, consider the psychological effect on a professional athlete like Joshua. He spent a lifetime cultivating awareness, discipline, and response. He's trained to notice subtle shifts in a ring, to react to a feint, a jab, a movement. Yet human attention is finite. There is only so much one can process at a time, even for someone with extraordinary focus. And warnings delivered through a glowing screen can feel abstract, removed from the immediacy of the body, the environment, the senses. Meanwhile, outside the hotel, the road waited. The Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, a major artery connecting the bustling city to other regions, was already busy. Trucks lined the shoulders. Motorcycles wove between cars. Ordinary life continued, oblivious to the unfolding chain of events in that hotel room. Every second was pushing the morning forward. Every decision, deliberate or unconscious, moving Joshua closer to the point of no return. Investigators would later focus heavily on the precise timeline of departures and messages. According to reports, there were discrepancies that raised alarms in their review. Timestamps on some messages allegedly indicated they were sent well before Joshua left the hotel, yet they remained unopened. Other messages may have arrived just minutes before the scheduled departure, moments when focus is fragmented, attention divided. The cumulative effect created a dangerous window, a fragile margin where action, or inaction, could make all the difference. This window, however, was invisible to those inside it. The luxury hotel room, with its neat bed, charging devices, and quiet calm, betrayed nothing. There were no sirens, no urgent knocks on doors, no flashing alerts commanding immediate attention. Just ordinary life, performing its ordinary routine. Then came the movement, the decision to depart. The convoy formed. Security vehicles, drivers briefed and prepared, followed behind. Inside the SUV, Joshua settled into his seat behind the driver. Another passenger was there. The rhythm of the morning, the momentum of habit, carried everyone forward. The warning messages remained unread, faintly glowing on screens left behind in that room. Signals of a concern that had yet to manifest. As the vehicles merged onto the expressway, the world outside accelerated to meet them. Other cars, trucks, and motorcycles moved at their own pace, oblivious to the fragile choreography of a convoy. The SUV, reportedly exceeding the speed limit, prepared for an overtaking maneuver. Every movement precise, every calculation informed by experience and routine. And yet, even precision can fail when unforeseen variables intervene. At approximately 11 a.m., the collision occurred. The SUV lost control during the maneuver, striking a stationary truck on the roadside. The impact was violent. Glass shattered. Metal crumpled. Ordinary morning chaos erupted into disaster in seconds. Footage later showed Joshua shirtless, dazed, seated among shards of glass, the human consequences of split-second events laid bare for the world to see. 2 people lost their lives. Others were injured. And one question lingered. Could this outcome have been different? Investigators, journalists, and onlookers began to reconstruct the timeline. They considered speed, vehicle positioning, road conditions, and driver actions. But increasingly, attention returned to a quieter, less obvious factor: the hotel room, the devices, the messages that may have gone unseen, the human element, the decisions made in moments of routine that precede crisis. The contrast is stark. Outside, chaos and destruction. Inside, silence and unread messages. The gulf between potential warning and actual disaster is terrifyingly narrow. It raises deeper questions about human behavior and decision-making. How often do we ignore signals because they are inconvenient, abstract, or non-urgent? How frequently does routine dull our perception of risk? And when we consider the lives of someone like Joshua, highly trained, surrounded by security, what does it say about our collective vulnerability? There's also the matter of timing. Investigators reportedly noted that some messages arrive during periods when attention is inherently limited. Early morning, before full consciousness takes hold. Moments when the mind is focused on immediate tasks, dressing, gathering belongings, preparing to move. Critical warnings arriving in that interval may have had little chance of being processed effectively, even if they were technically visible. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Modern life is filled with these gaps. Phones, alerts, notifications, messages, all designed to connect us, also create blind spots. The very technology meant to keep us informed can become a source of delayed awareness. Even someone surrounded by expertise and experience can fall victim to it. As the investigation delves deeper, attention will turn not just to what happened on the road, but to these quieter moments, the ones inside the hotel, inside the mind, inside the stream of digital communication. Because often, the difference between tragedy and safety is invisible until after the fact. And when investigators allegedly pieced together the timeline of messages, departures, and arrivals, they confronted a paradox. Every element, routine, attention, timing, human judgment, was normal in isolation. Yet, combined, they formed a perfect storm. A situation where a routine morning became catastrophic, and a set of unread warnings loomed over the events that followed. It's a story that challenges assumptions about safety, control, and foresight. It reminds us that vulnerability is not just about external hazards, but also about what we miss internally, within our own perceptions and habits. And it's a story that forces a simple, unnerving question on everyone watching. How much of what we ignore today could be the difference between life and death tomorrow? But what came next would take all of these threads, the routines, the unread warnings, the decisions, the convoy, and turn them into something no one could have anticipated. Something that would shock the world when it unfolded, seconds later, on that stretch of highway. The convoy moved steadily onto the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. To the casual observer, it was an unremarkable procession. SUVs and cars, engines humming, drivers attentive, security personnel positioned strategically. Anthony Joshua sat behind the driver, his posture relaxed, his mind likely focused on routine checks or perhaps on the day ahead. Another passenger sat beside him, quietly waiting, unaware of the events about to unfold. The world outside continued its rhythm. Trucks lumbering along the shoulder, motorcycles weaving between lanes, cars changing speed with the flow of traffic. But for those watching later, analyzing every frame, every second, there was a sense of inevitability. A chain of events triggered not by recklessness alone, but by a combination of human decisions, environmental factors, and the unheeded warnings lingering in the hotel room moments before departure. Speed was a critical factor. Nigerian road safety officials later stated that the SUV was believed to be traveling beyond the legally prescribed limit. When a vehicle exceeds safe speeds, even minor miscalculations can escalate into catastrophic consequences. The act of overtaking, a maneuver requiring precision and timing, became the pivotal moment in this chain. One misjudgment, one miscalculation in speed, angle, or distance, and everything changed in an instant. Think about the physics of that moment. The SUV, heavy with passengers, moves with inertia that cannot be immediately arrested. The tires grip the asphalt, friction interacts with momentum, and the slightest deviation from trajectory can determine whether a maneuver succeeds or fails. Experienced drivers may anticipate these factors, but no experience can completely negate the unpredictability of other elements. The weight of a vehicle, road conditions, the presence of other vehicles, and the very human element of reaction time. Then came the collision. The SUV lost control, striking a stationary truck parked on the side of the road. Metal crumpled, glass shattered, and chaos erupted. In the footage circulated online, Joshua is shirtless, sitting amid the wreckage, dazed, disoriented, yet alive. His presence in that moment, the image of calm, vulnerability, and shock, captured the world's attention. Millions watched, attempting to reconcile the image of a world-class athlete with the fragility displayed in those moments. 2 individuals lost their lives in the crash. Others were injured. The public narrative began to form immediately. Opinions, theories, speculation. But even as footage circulated, a quieter, more nuanced investigation began to take shape. Investigators examined not only the vehicles and road conditions, but also the prelude, the decisions made before departure, the convoy formation, and the messages that were allegedly left unread. It's easy to analyze crashes in hindsight. If only this had happened differently, people say. If only speed had been reduced. If only the vehicle had stopped. But these statements overlook the subtle, complex interplay of factors that make such incidents almost inevitable once the conditions align. The combination of human behavior, environmental circumstances, and timing of information created a fragile system where even small oversights became magnified. Investigators, according to sources, focused heavily on the timeline of communication. Those allegedly unread messages, warnings sent via WhatsApp to Joshua's devices, became central to understanding the human factors in play. Each message contained fragments of concern, urging caution, alerting to unusual activity along the highway. Their unacknowledged presence highlights the gap between information and action, a gap that in this case may have had life and death consequences. Consider the psychology at work. Joshua, like many elite athletes, operates in an environment dominated by schedules, habits, and routines. Attention is selective. Focus is trained on immediate priorities. Warnings delivered via digital channels can feel distant, abstract. Even messages that carry urgency can be cognitively filtered, postponed for later consideration. When the routine begins, when the convoy forms, the engines start, and momentum builds, the likelihood of engaging fully with secondary information diminishes sharply. Meanwhile, the dynamics of the road introduced another layer of unpredictability. Highways are complex systems. Multiple vehicles moving at varying speeds, each with different handling characteristics, drivers with different experience levels, and environmental factors such as road conditions, weather, and visibility. An overtaking maneuver requires perfect timing and spatial judgment. In this instance, the SUV's trajectory, compounded by excessive speed, produced the conditions for catastrophe. The aftermath was immediate and visceral. Metal twisted, glass scattered across asphalt. The SUV's passengers were thrown into a sudden, violent interruption of motion. Joshua, dazed but conscious, assessed the scene around him. The immediate priority for everyone was survival. Exiting the vehicle, assisting others, establishing safety. The images of the crash show both the chaos of impact and the stillness of human response, the stark contrast between violent movement and the frozen human form. As authorities arrived, they documented, secured, and analyzed. 5 men were reportedly involved in the collision, including Joshua and another passenger in the SUV, and personnel from other vehicles. Nigerian road safety officials began compiling statements, examining vehicle speeds, and evaluating adherence to traffic laws. Yet while the mechanical and procedural aspects were being addressed, a parallel investigation into human factors, decision-making, attention, and communication was quietly unfolding. And this brings us back to the messages, the digital warnings sent and reportedly left unread. Their timing and content became a focal point for investigators attempting to understand the interplay of risk and human behavior. Not the vehicle alone, not the road conditions alone, but the cascade of decisions and inactions that preceded the collision. Every minute matters. Every message carries potential significance, and the narrow window between reading and acting can define outcomes. Now, pause and reflect. Even someone surrounded by security, systems, and precautions is not immune to the subtleties of human attention. Habits, routines, and digital distractions can produce blind spots. The most meticulously organized plans are still subject to the limitations of human perception and cognition. This realization reframes the narrative. The crash was not solely an accident caused by speed or road conditions. It was also the culmination of routine, missed signals, and the invisible friction between intention and action. Every detail, from the night before to the split-second decisions on the highway, interacted in ways that made the outcome tragically plausible. And yet, it's crucial to remember that survival in such moments is as much about chance as it is about preparation. Joshua's minor injuries and the fact that he emerged alive contrast sharply with the loss of life in the same incident. This juxtaposition underscores the fragile boundary between disaster and survival, a boundary influenced by timing, reaction, and the unpredictable variables that exist in every complex system. Investigators would later analyze the devices and the unread messages with intense scrutiny. They sought to reconstruct not just the sequence of events on the highway, but also the sequence of awareness leading up to it. Who knew what when? Which warnings were sent? Which were seen or ignored? How did timing affect response? These questions, delicate and difficult to answer, form the core of a broader understanding of risk, attention, and human vulnerability. From a broader perspective, this incident illustrates a universal truth. No matter the level of training, preparation, or experience, humans remain susceptible to subtle oversights and misaligned timing. The interplay between routine and deviation, expectation and surprise, can generate situations where disaster becomes possible even in highly controlled environments. And so, as the investigation continues, the world watches. Footage is analyzed frame by frame. Messages are reviewed. Timelines are reconstructed. Observers seek understanding, attempting to reconcile the visible chaos with the invisible factors that precipitated it. The story extends beyond the crash itself into the realms of human psychology, digital communication, and the limitations of perception. But the most unnerving realization is this: the difference between survival and tragedy in that moment was not dictated solely by speed, position, or road conditions. It was also shaped by something far more subtle: timing, attention, and the messages that existed but were not acted upon. In other words, the story begins not on the highway, but in the quiet spaces of human behavior, in the hours before impact, in decisions both conscious and unconscious. And that's where the next chapter begins, inside the investigation itself, where every unread message, every timestamp, and every decision will be dissected to reveal a story far more complex than anyone anticipated. Investigators approach the aftermath of the crash like detectives entering a complex puzzle. Every detail mattered, no matter how small, seemingly insignificant, or easily overlooked. The SUV, now crumpled and immobile, held physical evidence of speed, impact angle, and the forces exerted during the collision. But the most crucial clues, according to sources familiar with the inquiry, were not in the twisted metal or shattered glass. They were digital. Joshua's devices, the phone and tablet that had sat quietly on the hotel nightstand, became central to the investigation. Investigators reportedly sought to understand what messages were sent, received, and, importantly, which had gone unread. The hypothesis was simple yet chilling. If warnings existed and were ignored, intentionally or inadvertently, how might that have shaped the sequence of events that morning? The devices were analyzed with meticulous care. Timestamps were scrutinized. Metadata was examined. Even the subtle order in which messages appeared could indicate patterns of attention, delay, or oversight. For instance, messages sent hours before departure could have remained unopened due to routine morning distractions. Messages arriving moments before the convoy began moving might have been glanced at, but not fully processed. Investigators were essentially trying to map human attention in the critical window before disaster. The alleged content of these messages, as described by sources, raised questions that extended far beyond traffic. Phrases like unusual activity near the highway suggested that the senders perceived risk. But the vagueness of that phrase also meant that its interpretation depended heavily on context and urgency. What constituted unusual activity? Were these concrete threats or preliminary observations that demanded vigilance but did not scream immediate danger? Investigators had to reconstruct the meaning through pattern, timing, and source credibility. At the same time, investigators examined the human factors surrounding the incident. Joshua, despite being a highly trained athlete, operates within the constraints of ordinary cognition. Human attention is limited, and even the most disciplined minds are susceptible to overload, routine, and distraction. Security personnel, likewise, make judgments under imperfect conditions, balancing the risk of overreacting against the risk of underestimating potential hazards. Convoy formation was another focal point. The SUV carrying Joshua reportedly followed standard security protocols, with other vehicles positioned behind to provide protection. Investigators considered the placement of passengers, driver's experience, vehicle speeds, and maneuvering strategies. Yet no amount of planning could fully eliminate the unpredictability inherent in high-speed road travel. The margin for error is thin, and when attention is divided or warnings go unheeded, that margin can vanish in seconds. When the SUV initiated the overtaking maneuver, the situation reached a critical point. Physics, vehicle dynamics, and driver judgment intersected with human error and unpredictability. According to road safety officials, the SUV lost control, colliding with a stationary truck. The violent impact produced injuries, fatalities, and a chaotic scene captured on footage that spread rapidly online. Joshua's image in the wreckage, shirtless, dazed, surrounded by shards of glass, became the focal point for global attention. Millions analyzed the video, speculated about causes, and debated responsibility. Yet, beneath the surface of public reaction, investigators were piecing together a quieter, more subtle narrative, a story about attention, timing, and the interplay between human behavior and digital communication. The timeline of the messages was particularly telling. Investigators reportedly noted a sequence that suggested a narrow but critical window where action, or inaction, could have influenced the outcome. Messages sent too early risked being overlooked amidst morning routines. Messages sent moments before departure may have arrived at a point when cognitive processing is inherently limited. Each minute, each second, compounded the potential for oversight. Psychology played a key role in this scenario. Humans often downplay warnings that do not appear immediate or concrete. This is amplified by routine. When mornings follow a predictable rhythm, subtle deviations are easily rationalized or dismissed. Even for someone like Joshua, whose professional life relies on situational awareness, the cognitive load of routine activities and preparation can create blind spots. Moreover, the investigation highlighted a paradox. Even with layers of security and structured planning, the most critical risks often arise from factors outside controlled parameters. Devices intended to inform and alert can become sources of delay. Attention is finite, and the human brain cannot fully process every potential warning simultaneously. The crash, therefore, was not merely the result of speed or road conditions. It was also a product of timing, information flow, and the invisible friction between perception and action. Investigators reportedly documented each message's status: read, unread, timestamped. They examined patterns to assess whether the sequence of information could have influenced decisions. Who sent what, and when? How quickly could Joshua or his team have reacted if messages had been engaged with immediately? Could any action have realistically altered the sequence of events? These questions extended beyond technical analysis into human judgment. Routine, distraction, and the assumption that everything would proceed normally created vulnerabilities. The investigation became not just about vehicles and roads, but about the fragile intersection between human decision-making and digital communication. Meanwhile, public scrutiny intensified. The narrative shifted from the crash itself to questions about preparedness, foresight, and responsibility. Analysts debated what could have been done differently, while experts considered the limits of prediction and human attention. Media coverage examined speed, convoy formation, and road safety, yet only a few focused on the subtler, digital dimension: the unread messages, the warnings, the moments lost to routine. As the investigation progressed, one theme became increasingly clear: survival and disaster are often separated by invisible margins. The SUV's occupants experienced one outcome. 2 other individuals tragically lost their lives. This contrast underscores the fragility of human systems and the narrow window in which decisions and awareness operate. And while mechanical and environmental factors were undeniable contributors, the alleged unread messages added a psychological dimension that investigators could not ignore. Timing, interpretation, attention, and response became central to understanding how such a sequence of events could culminate in tragedy. Ultimately, the investigation highlighted a universal truth: no level of planning, skill, or preparation can fully eliminate risk. Human behavior, cognition, and communication always introduce uncertainty. Routine can mask vulnerability. Digital messages can be overlooked. And in high-stakes situations, even minor delays or missed signals can have profound consequences. The messages themselves, glowing silently on Joshua's devices, became a focal point not only for investigators, but for anyone attempting to understand how tragedy unfolded in slow motion. According to sources, they were not generic check-ins or casual updates. They carried a tone of caution, warnings about unusual activity along the highway, advisories urging delay, alerts from security personnel trained to detect anomalies. Their intent was clear: to influence behavior, to prevent a departure that could place Joshua in harm's way. Yet intent alone is insufficient. Communication requires reception, comprehension, and action. Investigators reportedly analyzed how and when these messages were sent, and whether they could realistically have been processed in the limited window between awakening and departure. Early morning hours are notoriously challenging for attention. Even highly disciplined individuals are subject to cognitive limitations during transitional moments from sleep to alertness. Messages arriving at these moments, no matter how urgent, risk being glanced at, misinterpreted, or ignored entirely, not out of negligence, but simply because human perception is finite. The chain of responsibility, investigators considered, extended beyond the messages themselves. It involved the mechanisms for escalating warnings, the timing of delivery, the framing of urgency, and the cognitive state of the recipient. Each factor introduced potential points of failure. In other words, the technology designed to safeguard became, inadvertently, a repository of latent warnings, present, yet unacted upon. Meanwhile, the physical crash site offered its own insights. Analysis of the SUV's trajectory, point of impact, and vehicle deformation provided data on the forces involved and the timing of the collision. Nigerian road safety authorities reported that the vehicle, traveling above the prescribed speed limit, lost control while attempting an overtaking maneuver. Investigators correlated these mechanical findings with the human factors derived from message analysis. They sought to answer: could awareness of warnings have altered vehicle behavior? Could earlier engagement with these messages have prompted a change in timing, route selection, or driving approach? These inquiries revealed the profound interaction between human behavior and environmental factors. Even seasoned professionals, equipped with expertise and accompanied by security personnel, are subject to the unpredictability of real-world conditions. The crash was not the product of a single factor, but of a complex interplay. Speed, decision-making, routine, distraction, communication gaps, and environmental variability. Psychologists familiar with the investigation emphasized the role of cognitive load. Joshua, like any elite athlete, operates under significant mental and physical demands. Morning routines, preparations for scheduled engagements, and habitual behaviors contribute to an attentional focus that prioritizes immediate tasks. Warnings received via digital means, particularly when phrased ambiguously, may not penetrate this focus sufficiently to prompt immediate action. The consequences of such lapses, though small in isolation, can be magnified exponentially in dynamic, high-risk situations. Investigators reportedly examined the precise timing of message delivery in relation to convoy departure. Timestamps suggested a critical window in which the messages could have influenced decision-making. Early messages may have been overlooked due to routine morning distraction. Later messages may have arrived too close to departure to be fully considered. In either scenario, the opportunity for timely action diminished. Beyond timing, content also mattered. Messages reportedly referred to unusual activity rather than specific threats. Such vagueness introduces interpretative challenges. Recipients must assess the credibility and urgency of the information. Security personnel, accustomed to evaluating incomplete or ambiguous intelligence, often escalate alerts based on patterns or probability. However, for recipients outside the immediate analytical context, such messages may seem less pressing, further reducing the likelihood of timely response. The convoy formation also introduced complexity. Standard security protocols position vehicles strategically to provide protection and maintain control. Yet dynamic variables, vehicle weight, passenger distribution, road conditions, and traffic flow, introduced factors that could not be fully mitigated. The SUV's overtaking maneuver, executed under these conditions, represented a point at which small deviations could precipitate disaster. Investigators correlated vehicle telemetry and eyewitness accounts to reconstruct the sequence of actions leading to loss of control. When the collision occurred, its consequences were immediate and severe. Glass shattered, metal deformed, and occupants were thrown into sudden, violent motion. Joshua emerged visibly dazed, shirtless, but conscious, a testament to human resilience amidst catastrophic forces. Others were less fortunate. Fatalities occurred, underscoring the narrow line between survival and tragedy. In the aftermath, public attention focused largely on visible aspects, speed, maneuver, and crash footage. Yet investigators continued their more subtle inquiry, emphasizing human factors, timing, and communication. Unread messages were not merely digital artifacts. They represented potential interventions that were never realized. Analysts sought to determine whether interaction with these messages could have altered the outcome, even marginally. The broader implications of this inquiry extend beyond a single incident. It highlights the limitations of human cognition, the potential fragility of communication systems, and the ways in which routine can obscure risk. Even individuals surrounded by security, systems, and training remain vulnerable to the intersection of distraction, habit, and delayed information processing. Ultimately, the investigation revealed a complex mosaic. Mechanical forces, environmental conditions, decision-making patterns, and communication gaps converged to produce a preventable yet tragic outcome. The interplay of these elements underscores a sobering truth. Preparation and expertise mitigate risk but cannot eliminate it entirely. Vulnerability persists in the margins, moments of transition, fleeting lapses of attention, and unprocessed warnings. As scrutiny continues, one factor remains central: the human element. Messages glowing silently on devices, warnings sent but unacknowledged, routine behaviors maintained in the face of uncertainty, all contributed to a sequence of events that escalated into disaster. The delicate balance between awareness and action, routine and deviation, highlights the invisible forces shaping human outcomes. And as investigators delved deeper into the timeline, comparing messages, actions, and consequences, they confronted a haunting realization. Survival and tragedy are separated by slender threads, often invisible until the moment passes. Every second, every decision, every moment of attention or inattention can determine outcomes in ways that defy expectation. But the story does not end with analysis alone. The emotional and psychological dimensions, how individuals process warnings, respond to risk, and interpret ambiguous signals, add a layer of complexity that technology cannot capture. And it is this convergence of human cognition, communication, and circumstance that sets the stage for the next phase of the investigation, revealing insights that will shock and challenge perceptions of control, safety, and responsibility. By the time authorities secured the crash site and began documenting the incident, the investigation had already shifted focus from what was visible to what was hidden. Inside minds, inside devices, inside the tiny gaps where human attention and timing intersect. The physical aftermath, the twisted SUV, the scattered glass, the injured and deceased, was obvious. But the subtler, perhaps more consequential story lay in the digital traces left behind. Investigators reportedly began reconstructing a minute-by-minute timeline of Joshua's morning, cross-referencing messages sent and received on his phone and tablet, convoys departing, and vehicle telemetry. Their goal was not to assign blame, but to understand causality. How did a day that began as routine escalate into tragedy so quickly? The messages, some allegedly unread, became central to this inquiry. Security personnel, according to sources, had long been aware of the unpredictability of road travel in that region. Reports of unusual vehicles, traffic irregularities, or even rumors of roadside hazards are not uncommon. In most circumstances, these are logged, assessed, and acted upon according to priority and probability. When warnings are transmitted to principals, in this case, Joshua, the efficacy of those messages depends entirely on reception and interpretation. And this is where investigators reportedly found the critical failure point. The early morning hours are inherently challenging for cognition. Even highly trained individuals are susceptible to decreased attentional capacity shortly after waking. Messages delivered during this window, particularly when phrased vaguely, risk delayed processing. Investigators, according to sources, analyzed not just the messages themselves, but the cognitive context in which they arrived. The question was simple, yet profound. Could timely attention to these alerts have prevented the collision, or at least altered its severity? Convoy analysis added another layer. Standard operating procedures were reportedly followed. The SUV carrying Joshua was flanked by security vehicles, drivers briefed, and routes predetermined. Yet investigators recognized that controlled planning cannot account for every variable. Human attention, vehicle dynamics, and environmental conditions interact in unpredictable ways. Even slight deviations, speed, angle, timing, can have outsized consequences when compounded with other factors. As part of this reconstruction, investigators considered the physics of the overtaking maneuver. The SUV, reportedly exceeding speed limits, attempted to pass slower traffic. Vehicle mass, tire traction, road gradient, and the presence of adjacent vehicles all contributed to the instability that resulted in the crash. While mechanical factors are quantifiable, human decision-making introduces variability that cannot be precisely predicted. This is where the interplay between unread warnings and driver action becomes central. The crash itself was violent. Footage circulating online depicted Joshua shirtless, dazed, seated amid shattered glass. The SUV's deformation, the force of impact, and the trajectories of all occupants were meticulously documented. 2 fatalities occurred, highlighting the narrow margin between survival and loss. This stark contrast drew attention not only to the crash mechanics, but also to the invisible factors leading up to the collision. Investigators reportedly examined whether engagement with warnings could have influenced decisions. Could a message read minutes earlier have altered departure time, route choice, or driving behavior? The analysis emphasized the subtle interplay between perception, attention, and action. Every second matters. Every delay magnifies risk, and even small lapses in processing critical information can escalate into irreversible outcomes. Beyond technical analysis, the inquiry revealed insights about human behavior and communication. The messages themselves illustrate a paradox of modern life. The very tools designed to safeguard can also contribute to delayed awareness. In a world of constant notifications, the challenge is discerning urgency from background noise. For someone like Joshua, with multiple devices and hundreds of daily communications, cognitive triage is inevitable. Investigators reportedly used this incident as a case study in human factors, attention management, and risk perception. The intersection of routine, distraction, and digital communication exemplified how high stakes can be undermined by subtle, almost imperceptible lapses. The crash was not solely a mechanical failure, but a systemic one, where human cognition, behavior, and communication converged in tragic alignment. Psychologists involved in the review emphasized that even highly disciplined individuals are vulnerable to these gaps. Habits and routines, while providing structure and efficiency, can mask risk. Digital warnings require not only transmission but reception and comprehension, steps vulnerable to timing, cognitive load, and perceived urgency. In Joshua's case, the combination of these factors created a window in which disaster became possible. Public scrutiny quickly followed, focusing on speed, maneuvering, and the visible chaos. Yet the deeper narrative, the role of unread messages, the cognitive environment, and the timing of alerts, remained largely invisible. This underscores a critical lesson. Technological safeguards and human planning can mitigate risk, but cannot eliminate the unpredictability inherent in complex systems. Ultimately, the investigation highlighted that survival is often a function of timing, awareness, and the subtle interplay between action and inaction. The unread messages, the routine departure, and the high-speed maneuver converged in a way that was tragically consequential. Even with planning, expertise, and protective measures, the human element, attention, interpretation, and decision-making, remains a critical variable. And as authorities continued to reconstruct timelines, analyze messages, and simulate scenarios, one unsettling reality emerged. The difference between tragedy and survival is often invisible, shaped by seconds, perception, and the fragile window in which information can be processed. The crash did not simply occur on the highway. It began in that quiet hotel room, in the moments before devices were checked, in the interplay between routine and risk, in the space where human attention falters. But what came next would reveal the full weight of these invisible forces, as investigators began connecting the dots between unread warnings, human behavior, and the devastating outcomes on the highway. A chain of events that no one could have anticipated until the moment it unfolded. The investigation's next phase turned to a more delicate and revealing dimension: human communication under pressure. Investigators reportedly focused on the content, timing, and context of the messages left unread on Joshua's devices. Each message was analyzed not simply for what it said, but for the potential influence it might have had on decisions made in the critical hours leading up to the crash. The goal was to understand the human factors at play, not just the mechanical or environmental ones. According to sources, some of these messages were sent by members of Joshua's security detail, professionals trained to detect anomalies, anticipate threats, and alert principals to potential dangers. Others were from close contacts who may have had situational awareness of the environment outside the hotel. The combined intent was clear: caution, delay, awareness. But intent alone is never enough. The critical question is whether the recipient perceives urgency and acts upon it. Investigators were attempting to answer precisely that. One of the striking aspects of this digital trail was timing. Messages sent too early risk being overlooked, buried in a sea of notifications, or preoccupied attention. Messages sent too close to departure might have arrived during transitional moments. When cognitive capacity is limited, attention is fragmented, and actions are already in motion. Human perception is notoriously fallible in these windows, and even high-profile athletes accustomed to rigorous discipline are not immune.